the chairman of the... Welcome to the 5th edition of Legal Affairs. I'm Stephen Yap. In the studio today, I have Mr. Lawrence Ma, the chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Stephen.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has always imputed that the United States and the United Kingdom in interfering with our internal affairs. Why would these Western countries want to meddle in our internal affairs? How do they do that? Do they do that by foreign spies in Hong Kong? Now, Lawrence, I understand you have written extensively on national security in Hong Kong. Can you explain this to us?
Yes, Stephen. We have to come from a historical perspective that after the Cold War, there has been a fight between two factions. One is the capitalist faction led by the United States, and the communist faction led by the former Russia. Iron Curtain, as we call it, the Iron Curtain. There has been always in the Cold War that the Americans wanted to bring down the Russian government. And there has been all these spy stories about 007 and all these stories. Now, but the reality is, how did the American won the Cold War? America was actually in those days, it was the President Ronald Reagan. In United Kingdom, that would be Margaret Thatcher. And in those days, it was Mikhail Gorbachev who was leading Russia. And what they did was Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan befriended with Mikhail Gorbachev, convinced Mikhail Gorbachev that the Western countries were his friends. And Mikhail Gorbachev in those days, the communist countries, including China was very poor in those days, but Russia was also poor. What they really wanted is to get rich. They wanted to look at the Western countries and see how they develop. And Reagan and Margaret Thatcher was able to convince Mikhail Gorbachev that, yes, look at us. We are a capitalist country. We are so rich. If you want to be us, you have to do a political reform first before your economic reform. Don't think about economy first. You have to do up your political system. Do a reform first. And why Mikhail Gorbachev was asking, why we have to do political reform first? Oh, the reason is simple. To liberate individuals so as to invigorate private economy. That was the reason. There was a beautiful reason given by Reagan and Thatcher to Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev actually was led to believe that. Was led to believe it. So therefore, Mikhail Gorbachev was leading a political reform first. And what happened? It actually led to the total disintegration of Russia. So what happened to China? What's that got to do with us? Is the Western power actually got a perfect result from their sort of internal transformation policy, internally transform Russia. They don't need to fight a war. They won the Cold War because Russia was willing to follow their advice to do a political reform. China was much more smarter. We are more intelligent. Mr. Deng Xiaoping disbelieved in orders. Mr. Deng Xiaoping was leading a economic reform. So China was also in the same shoes as Russia. We were so poor. So we also wanted to get rich. But Mr. Deng Xiaoping was smart enough not to fall into the same trap that Russia has fallen into. What we did was we put economic reform first and political reform to come second. So we have our open door policy in 1979, 1982, to actually setting our path to become the world's manufacturing country, right? So that we do not fall into that.
Does the USA, United States of America, and Western powers have a plan to topple the Chinese Communist Party?
Yes, if you talk about a plan, that would be more than a plan. If there is actually a foreign policy which the Americans would deny. It is called the China containment policy. They deny that being a formal, actual foreign policy of them because it is insidious. The first thing is currency front. You know that they accuse us as a currency manipulator. They always want us to revaluate our currency instead of devaluation. Once we revaluate our RMB, that means our export would be more expensive. Our export would be less competitive with others. That would be a detriment to our economy. The second thing is they wanted to contain the RMB. They do not want the RMB to go globalized. So the internationalization of RMB, they will keep destroying it. The second is energy front. As you understand, Henry Kissinger, who was the Secretary for State in the Nixon era, was saying that control oil, you control nations. So we all understand that if China wants to develop, we need a lot of energy, all right? And one of the source of energy is to acquire energy from overseas. And we have, in those days, successfully acquired the largest oil field in the world, which is situated in Sudan. We've signed a contract with the Sudan government for continuous supply of petrol and oil. The Americans got news of it, got wind of it. Actually, they set up a color revolution in Sudan to use genocide as a reason to topple the government that was favorable to China. So as a result of the government being toppled, the Sudan government being toppled, our contract with Sudan has collapsed. That is how they use energy front. The fourth is economic front. As you know that we rely heavily on our export. We have a cheap labor force. And what the American was doing, particularly during the Trump era, was to impose extraordinary tariffs on our products in contravention of the World Trade Organization trade pact. So that was a blatant example of how they contain us economically. And fifthly, military. Military was very important. After the 9/11 era, 9/11 era was about all the problems of the Middle East countries causing problems to the United States, right? After that's finished, after the death of Saddam Hussein, after the death of Osama bin Laden, then the Middle East problem has been also partly resolved. And there was the rise of China. So what they did was the Obama's pivot to Asia, return to Asia's policy. That means that all the military have to come back to Asia. And we have the US-backed Philippine South China Sea arbitration, which resulted in an unfair decision of the arbitration court, which held that we have contravened or we have infringed the Philippines' right to passage in the South China Sea. Remember that the arms sale to Taiwan, the defense pact with Taiwan, they trained soldiers in Taiwan to sort of defend Taiwan against any invasion of China, which is obviously our internal country's internal problem. And proxy war, we'll cover proxy war later, but that means it would be very expensive to send troops and soldiers and weaponry to another country to fight a war, to topple their regime in order to set up a regime that is complacent to the American interests. What they did is they used the local proxies locally to make them a weapon, to equip them, to fund them, to train them, so that they would become a soldier in their own right to topple their own government for the sake of the Americans. So that would be a proxy war, and Hong Kong was actually in 2019 got into that problem. And the sixth front was the diplomatic front, so that the string of pearl, that means the American would strengthen ties with our adjacent neighbors. They would allow, for example, India, Vietnam, and the Philippines to have nuclear weapons. They would allow South Korea to build mid-range missiles in the name of defense. But these sort of defense missiles would be able to shoot long enough to cover the vast part of China. So that is one of that. And if they set up diplomatic connections with all these adjacent countries, that would block our way to get oil and raw material supply from, for example, Africa and the Persian Gulf. And then they set up the Five Die Alliance with Australia, United Kingdoms, New Zealand, and all this, so that they would be able to interchange information and intelligence to contain China. And the seventh is a media front. Media front is old-fashioned propaganda to use news agencies in a particular country for them to spread news about the negative side of the government. And obviously, we all in Hong Kong know about the Apple Daily. Apple Daily has been so instrumental, particularly its boss, Mr. Jimmy Lai, who was so instrumental in toppling the Communist Party regime. And they actually spread a lot of anti-government messages during the 2017 Occupying Central and 2019 the anti-extradition bill riots. So that's all the front they used in China containment policy to topple our regime.
Lawrence, has Hong Kong been used by these foreign spies to topple the Chinese Communist Party?
Yes, as I said before, they would have sent in their people from overseas. They would send in CIA agents. They would undercover as a diplomat in our consulate, in our embassies. They would have a diplomatic protection. They would be coming in with a diplomatic passport. You cannot arrest them for any offenses they've committed locally. So with that protection and cover, they would be able to train local proxies to fight the proxy war, as I said before, just before, the military front proxy war. So instead of sending troops to topple governments, they would use proxies locally, like some of our student members who were like Joshua Wong and others. They would use proxies, train them, fund them, equip them, and so that they would be able to play the role as a soldier in Hong Kong, and then to gather up public support